Okay. So how many people here would identify as designers? We got 3. It was like maybe 2.5. You barely raised your hand. Okay. So I think what we'll talk about today is, clearly about wearables, but some design strategies and how we think about them. So we're both from a service design agency called Fjord in San Francisco, and have been thinking a lot about this ecosystem. And especially, with IoT, it's becoming, more and more of a thing that our, clients are coming to us, and they're at that kind of beginning stage where they're still a little unsure. What do I do in this space? What am I thinking about? How do I make this, relevant for our end customers? And it's at still experimental phase. So what we've been doing is trying to structure, some thoughts around this. How do we, look at this from a strategic point of view? Wearables has clearly been kind of the leading edge here, which we, discussed in our last session. And it's been kind of driving IoT forward for us. And it's the first place that our customers are really coming to us thinking about. The smartwatch is really the driving force there for them. They're thinking, how can we get our experience, to make sense contextually in that environment? So that's kind of what we're thinking about. So when we're looking at IoT, it's something that we're considering pretty holistically, but we're kind of diving down on specifically some of the wearables. And we're still in that really early stage for wearables where, there hasn't been a form factor that's really taken a hold. If we look at stuff like mobile phones, we've kind of all decided there's a common form factor here. But at this point, we have devices of all different types. We have necklaces, watches, smart fabrics, all this kind of stuff that's in play. But how do we start to come up with some design strategy that kind of unifies these and something that we can address any of these different types of devices with? So the first thing that we start looking at is kind of what's the market betting on. So this is IoT venture capital investing by category from 2011 to 2014. So you can see health and wellness is driving this kind of far and away here. So 34.5% of all investments have been made in health and wellness. And then we start to get into other stuff, location-based navigation, healthcare, business intelligence, patient monitoring. So you can see there's a lot of other categories here, but it's still one of those kind of fuzzy unknowns. I think health and wellness, because the form factors and the use cases are pretty easy to make sense of, that's what's leading the industry. But as we start to progress, we'll start to see some of those other more interesting use cases really start to come about. So specifically in wearables, what do people really want? So this is kind of the main thing that we're taking a look at now. And again, it's the first 3 here are exercise smarter, collect and track medical information, and eat better. So people are still clearly wanting to kind of invest in this kind of health and lifestyle and wellness area. But the other ones below that are still finding retail deals, controlling home appliances, access to entertainment, plugging into social media. There's a lot of untapped use cases that we need to start thinking about and making sense of. So I think as far as the overall market, the health and wellness will still lead for a long time, but we need to be really conscientious of what are those other things, especially if we look at medical and industry uses. I think that it's very untapped there. And this is actually really similar to one of the slides that we saw in the last session, but kind of how big is the challenge? So this is the actual and forecasted smart wearable unit sales by category. So this is the reason that we're kind of narrowing down onto the watch form factor. As far as what we're trying to recommend for clients and kind of what we're thinking about as far as best practices go. So you can see by 2020 there will be, it differs a little bit depending on the graph that you look at, but we're looking at almost 200 million wearables in the marketplace. So it's a huge number, and the majority will be smartwatches. And we all know that the Apple Watch just launched and has been pretty successful so far. We've gotten a few for the office and have all been playing with them. So we have some kind of initial opinions of some of the features and functionality there and the overall kind of service that they're providing. which we'll talk about a little bit today. But this is really kind of the first device that's kind of ushered in that age of the fully mature graphic interface, right? Before this, we had some kind of bleeding edge stuff from Google, Motorola, from Pebble. But as far as us getting kind of fully baked interaction patterns and something that's promising, and I put promising in air quotes, to be as fully baked as an iPhone, right? Which is an experience that we're all pretty familiar with, and has become a kind of standard device for everybody around the world, really. It's promising to be that good, and I think time will tell if that platform is, but this is why we're giving this a lot of consideration. So when we start to think about, the devices, one thing we really want to make sure that we're being considerate of is that wearables aren't replacements for other types of digital experiences. When we look at stuff like this, you look at the Microsoft Watch on the left, I think there's 12 individual pieces of UI on this, things that you have to interact with or understand. And David actually came up with a great term the other day, is that we're going to all start getting pinky fatigue. Because when we're using our watches, you're sitting like this, and eventually we're all going to have arthritis in our pinkies from using UI that's like this, right? If you look at the other example, I think this is like month-over-month projections on someone's watch, which seems like the worst experience ever invented. And the kind of overtly hilarious thing here is that because for the near term, we're all going to be relying on data connections to our phones, that phone is in your back pocket, and it's a much better way to actually look at that type of information. You would never, ever want to look at month-over-month projections on your watch. Do the design themes. The 4 that we're going to look at today, and we actually have a little bit of a broader set, but for time constraints or lack thereof, we'll look at 4 of them today. And these, I think, are the ones that we're trying to be the most conscious of whenever we're approaching any sort of kind of wearable design challenge. So glanceability, ambient to personal, consistency across service gaps, and non-visual UI. So we'll just jump straight into glanceability. So we know that our screens have shrunken and gotten smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where with stuff like this, our screen has gotten down to the point where on the Misfit it's I think a dozen LEDs and that's it, right? So we need to start thinking about how can we make our wearables glanceable. So we can really start to do what wearables are meant to do, which is to recede into the background of our lives a little bit and support us in the tasks that we want to do and not get in the way. So really, how do we design interfaces that let people get meaning from data at a glance? That's the goal here. And the challenge is, I need information, but I'm busy doing something else. I should be concentrating on something, but I'm trying to look at my watch while I'm driving my car. Or I need to do something quickly. I need to interact with a service, but my concentration is clearly 100% elsewhere, except for this person who's taking a selfie of themselves while wearing Google glasses, riding their bike. It's probably not the safest thing you could be doing. So when we're looking at these challenges, we're looking really at what's the difference between status and tasks. With status, it's really kind of what's going on with the system. For tasks is how can I actually interact with the system? And so we need to figure out ways that these are inherently glanceable. So status, this is something that is kind of the initial promise of wearables, right? We want to know what we're doing and how we're doing at any given moment. My Fitbit does a great job at that. I can get some key information. It's pretty glanceable, although it's in my pocket, so that took me 3 seconds to pull out and click through a couple buttons. It's not inherently glanceable. The watch starts to get a little bit closer, but it depends on the kind of level of fidelity of the screens that we're designing. If they get too complex, we start to lose glanceability, and it starts to fall apart. The Misfit Shine, it's kind of great. It shows you a snapshot of your status at a given moment, but otherwise it just kind of recedes into the background. Looking at something like the Pebble, it's kind of measuring and displaying tons of different types of data, but it's relying on some kind of antiquated UI paradigms. So we have stuff like the kind of tray bar in the top, this area where you can see your music's playing, your volume, you're connected to some Wi-Fi and some Bluetooth, battery levels. It's a lot of stuff to unpack. Those, on a watch face, those graphics are just a couple pixels tall. And then you have all these other elements. I think the only thing that's probably truly glanceable on here is the time. And now we're back to just having a watch. We're not doing much better than an actual watch. Otherwise, you have to kind of really stare at it. And the distance that we're having to stare at our watches from is a lot different than a phone, which a phone is actually a little bit more of a natural interaction where you hold it about here. You're looking at it from about 2 feet away. With the watch, you're actually getting right up here. So if we think that, it's dangerous, walking down the street holding your phone, walking down the street trying to interact with your watch is going to be 10 times worse. And fitness ones are doing a good job at this. The Nike band is doing a nice job where it's abstracting a data set and providing you a score. So same kind of thing a lot of them do. Misfit does it well. But taking this complex data set and boiling it down to just a graphic here, which is, this area at the bottom, you can see a nice kind of color-coded graphic that tells you exactly how you're doing at any given moment. I don't have to, as a user, understand anything other than, what's my general performance on a given day and what's my performance now. So it's kind of 2 data points that I have to infer at a given moment, and it's really easy to deal with. Oops. Fitbit, again, does a pretty good job with this. They've kind of created this weird little flower graphic, and it's kind of nice when you actually turn your Fitbit on. It's generally the default graphic on your device, so you get a quick overview of like, how am I doing at any given moment? So this flower kind of grows and recedes throughout the day to show you how active you're being. And it's a nice way that they're using something other than just the numbers to start to get to that idea of how are you doing, what's your status at any given moment. So we need to think about how stuff like shape, brightness, color, maybe even motion, all these kinds of things can play to get us to a point where I don't have to, as a user, understand what my data set means. This was a kind of proof of concept that someone was working on. And this is actually a hydration meter. So it measures your current hydration levels. And it's giving you 2 data points to help you make a decision to whether or not you need to drink more water. So the first number here is the last time you drank water, and you reset that by hitting the button on the side of it. And then the measurement below that is actually a sensor that they're still working on, but it measures your current hydration level in your body. So with those 2 data points, you have perfect cause and effect. When did I drink water? What's my hydration level? So people with a medical need where they really need to stay hydrated, it's something that lets them kind of make a decision pretty easily. And with a single glance, they understand the cause and effect of their medical condition or the solution to. When we think about activity, we need to start thinking about what are those ways that we can actually engage with a service kind of on the go or at a glance. So with this example, I have no idea what's going on here. This was someone's mock-up for a watch keyboard UI. It's kind of pretty in some ways, but I have no idea how to use it. Unless this watch is 2 feet across, I think I would be lost. I think this is like serious pinky fatigue. So we need to start thinking about what are those actions that you can do on a watch that are kind of natively going to work on that format, opposed to trying to port over some other type of existing UI and trying to squeeze it into the watch frame. So one way that we started looking at this is looking at single serving activities. So what are those actions you can do that only allow you to make one decision point, one action? So is it reply, navigate, something like that? We need to also start thinking about what are those other ways that you can interact with the device. So is it tap to reply, swipe to ignore, shake to dismiss? We have a lot of interaction patterns that are inherent to some of the wearables that we have. So let's try to make use of those as much as possible. Tesla was one of the first companies that came out with a kind of fully baked Apple Watch app, and they've done a pretty nice job with it. So the UI I don't think is inherently glanceable. Some of it's a little overly complicated, but you can do some cool stuff like lock and unlock your doors, at a tap. So you have kind of a single activity where you can just interact with it that way. And the thing that's nice is they're not actually giving you a big button that says, unlock doors. You're actually interacting with the UI itself. So you're tapping on the car, it unlocks, and it shows you some visual feedback. And the visual feedback, I think, is something that's really important. As we've been playing with the Apple Watch, it's kind of missing in their platform a little bit. There's not great feedback of user actions. And I think as the apps mature a little bit, we'll get to a point where they're a little bit better. But right now, it's a little bit lacking. And one of the last ways that we've been seeing some nice kind of extended interactions work is stuff like following a recipe. So here it's an extended interaction. You're going to glance at your watch over and over for something like following a recipe or instructions. And they're using a really simple carousel here. So instead of using a scroll where you can get lost somewhere within the scroll, here every piece of content's broken up into a bite-sized piece. You can swipe through it really kind of easily and organically. And the nice thing is every time you swipe between the different panels, the number here updates, which is the amount of time remaining in your recipe, and the text always remains formatted in the exact same spot. So every time you look back at your watch, it's formatted exactly the same. So there's a lot of consistency between steps. So like I said at the beginning, the main thing we really want to do here is kind of support the user's adventure. It's not like with when phones first came out, it was how can we get in front of the user? How can we send them notifications? How can we get them to engage more and spend more time using their phone? The promise of wearables is really to recede into the background and empower people to kind of live their life how they want to without having to be kind of consumed all the time by technology. So the quick summary is for status, keep it as simple as possible, and I think that's kind of an umbrella statement for all wearables. Summarize and score data sets when we can, make information as visual as possible. Use for activity, we want to use single serving actions where we can. Even things that are a yes or a no are pretty easy to interact with, but if we can boil them down to a single thing, that's always key for us. And then use simple visual feedback to confirm those actions.
Cool. So the next theme that we definitely want to think about when designing for these devices is kind of what we're calling ambient to personal, or making this transition from essentially public to private when examining the dual nature of these devices. So basically it's thinking about that balance between the personal utility and essentially the public expression, because these are, at the end of the day, fashion items. Not just that, but that in addition to many other things. So, sometimes we'll be using these devices to do very, intimate, very personal tasks. So I'm paying, I'm sending messages to someone close to me. But a lot of the time, and I would even argue most of the time, we're just expressing ourselves. We're hanging out. It's the watch is here at my side. It's doing its thing. The band is maybe matching something here. The screen on the Apple Watch, I'm a little disappointed because I was expecting sort of an ambient screensaver-like thing that I might be able. I think battery life is probably the issue there. But I think moving forward, we would want to expect some sort of dynamic expression, some sort of ambient display. Be that as it may, we still need to think about this transition from this public mode to the private mode. It's a very interesting dichotomy that's sort of posed by these devices, simply because now all of a sudden we're wearing our conversations. So I think the Apple Watch has done a decent job in kind of it turns on when you turn your wrist, but still we have the opportunity for having wearing embarrassing things. We're wearing our hearts not on our sleeves, but maybe on our wrists now, and essentially, public data that is essentially pretty private. So now we're wearing health data. So thinking about this transition as designers, it helps to kind of bucket it in two ways. So there's a planned transition. So I, by my own volition, now need to use the watch to accomplish a task. Unplanned is I'm interrupted. I'm jolted out of this ambient state, this expressive state, into the private mode. So in thinking about these two, we have a few principles that we can start thinking about. And some of this is limited by the technology, but I think as we move forward, as long as we have this on our minds, some of that may drive the technology moving forward. So for planned shift, Apple does it fairly decently. I flip my wrist and then it lights up. What about other applications? What about other uses of this orientation recognizing of the device? One device that does this very nicely is Nest. So you approach it and it kind of wakes up. I don't know exactly how it does it. Maybe some sort of proximity sensing would be useful. With this device, I think proximity would be nice because sometimes I'm actually facing the right way and my notifications don't light up. Freezer case in the store near my house that as I walk by, it lights up. And it's super useful. It's just, I'm close, it lights up, it knows I'm there, simple. So we can think about these types of interactions and enforcing those for planned shifts. Voice be very useful. So Google, I think, is doing this. Wake up, listen to me, that kind of thing. Maybe I don't want to flick my wrist, or maybe I'm already in the right position, but I still need it to wake up and listen to me. So we can use voice for planned shifts as well. For unplanned, I think the polite thing to do is vibrate first, tap me first, and then maybe display second. Having smart defaults, or rather considerate defaults. I think the Apple Watch, again, as an example, does an okay job at this, but there were a few times out of the box I set it up and it was ringing profusely, and it would have been nice if that out of the box, it would have been more of a subtle, sort of a subtle tap. Again, recognizing the orientation. So if my hand is already in the right position, it would be great if it knew that. So I don't have to force some sort of gesture to wake it up. There are a few moments, so if you're lying back in bed, for example, and you're reading something or you have your arm in this position, the watch doesn't wake up because you haven't done that particular gesture. So there's some things we can think about moving forward for these unplanned shifts as well. And again, the key here being considerate defaults. I think we have a nice beta version here with some of these considerate defaults in place. But let's think about those as we move forward and we design and we create apps where we might have more control of what's the default setting on the incoming communication, for example. So in summary, from ambient to personal, we can think of these in two different ways of shifting from this public to private mode. Some are planned shifts, so of my own volition. Let's be aware of the device orientation if we can. Let's consider voice, consider my gestures. Ideally keeping this one-handed so I don't have to come over here and tap to wake it up, because all of a sudden we go from potentially one-handed to a two-handed device, which, as a side note, this device I'm convinced is still a two-handed device. It pretty much is. And if we can unlock easily using all these methods, that's ideal. And then for unplanned shifts, let's just be considerate, or let's have some considerate defaults, maybe vibrating first, displaying second, for example. Again, being aware of the device orientation. If it's faced outward, and I know that information, maybe then for sure vibrate first, for example. So that's ambient to personal. The next one we want to think about is non-visual interfaces. So we have an entire world of new ways of getting information into and out of these devices, essentially. And a lot of that is driven, obviously, by the fact that the screens are so small, and we can't rely on that input and feedback mechanism that we have for so many years. What are some of these opportunities? Voice, obviously, especially as the technology improves. Gesture recognition, we all remember being able to shake our iPhone and do things maybe a little bit ahead of its time. I think now we'll have, or at least there's a promise of more granular gesture recognition, so I could maybe do particular gestures and get a certain output. But again, the biggest challenge is that this interaction paradigm that we're used to, especially on mobile devices, screen-based, multi-touch, doesn't really work. We're obscuring what we actually want to see, and we don't really have the runway to do such interactions. So they don't really translate, and our display real estate is extremely limited. And maybe most importantly, we don't necessarily want to be looking at screens anyway. Especially if I'm out and about and being active. Maybe I want information, maybe I want my devices to direct me where to go, but I don't necessarily want to look at them. So there are a few challenges, but with those challenges, I think, come really interesting opportunities, especially for interaction designers. And we can think of these in a traditional way, which is, what are the user inputs? How do I get information into the system? And then how do I see that information come back to me? What's the feedback? So the opportunities around inputs are vocal control, position and acceleration. So maybe if I do a certain gesture, it sends a tweet or an email or any number of these activities I could assign to an input gesture. We have health data, and I think right now that's limited to the apps that read that, but it's still input data that we could potentially use for something. Again, haptic input is going to be interesting, so being able to tap is a new one. So maybe it's tap twice to send an email, tap 3 times to send a tweet home. Who knows what it is, but we have this potential of an evolving language. As far as user feedback goes, we have the haptics as well, so it's a new one, as well as sound if we've hooked up to Bluetooth headphones and so on. So we'll just go through a few of these opportunities. Voice, I think, very obvious. It's kind of nice. We're almost there with the untethered devices. As earlier speaker said, we'll probably get there in a few years. We can pretty much bet on that and on vocal control being a way to do certain things at least. It does certain things really well, as I'm kind of gradually discovering. I never set alarms or timers anymore going through the GUI list. For example, I'll just say to Siri, set an alarm tomorrow for 6 a.m. and I'm done. So things like that, we're already seeing the extreme power of vocal control. And with Amazon Echo, that's, as Peter has become addicted to, there's a lot of opportunities there.
Anybody here actually use the Amazon Echo?
Yeah.
The most revolutionary device ever.
Yeah, Peter will talk.
Amazing.
We'll use the remainder of our time so Peter can talk to you about the Echo. Again, so input opportunities, Google, the OK Google paradigm for, we do it on desktop, we can use it in wearables as well. Interesting one is position. So we all remember the Shake 2 X, Y, or Z. But now we have the promise within the gesture recognition chip, or at least so I've been reading, of recognizing custom gestures. So maybe it's, fist bump to tweet, or who knows what it is. You can use your imagination. But we may have that capability as a non-screen-based input mechanism. Health data, again, you can't necessarily control, but maybe we can use it for something. It's still an interesting non-screen-based input.
I think that one's actually one of the most interesting ones.
Yeah.
Just because as we start to think of health data, we've only thought about it as far as kind of fitness goes at this point, and maybe kind of that health and lifestyle area. But how does that actually start to play into things like security or other types of experiences where it's maybe changing content based on your mood, stuff like that. So I think we're at the tip of the iceberg. It's really about getting different types of sensors into these wearables that can start to track other elements. But I think that the biometric element can't be understated here.
Yeah. Again, so with this device at least, I've started experimenting with the sort of peer-to-peer tapping. It's still kind of in process, but I think moving forward we'll be able to do very interesting things with I can assign 3 taps to send a certain message, and that's very easy for me. I don't have to look at this device at all. I can receive 2 taps or 2 vibrations in response, and then I'm kind of untethered to the screen, which is kind of nice. Yeah, exactly. We're back to Morse code or your own code. And then feedback opportunities. So we have haptics, we have vibration as ways of circumventing the screen. This project is really interesting. You can navigate using vibrating bicycle handlebars, which is a lot better than on your bike kind of looking at a GPS or Maps app. So vibrating on the left side for turn left now, similar for the right side. Really nice paradigm we can start thinking about for directional kind of applications, and then beyond. And then sound, obviously, this will be a big one as a feedback mechanism. With these devices, you'll require, Bluetooth headphones if you don't want to annoy everybody. That doesn't necessarily stop people, but still a good feedback mechanism. And then, just in summary here, so we have, shrinking screens. They're no longer as useful, but we have this whole world that may open up to us and allow us to circumvent that. Maybe we didn't need it in the first place. So we have sound input, we have position, orientation, we have health data, we have the ability of maybe emerging tapping languages. And on the feedback side, we have tactile feedback as well, in addition to sound. So really interesting to start thinking about that. I know that we're limited somewhat by OS requirements and things like that, but as long as it's on our minds and to the extent that we have to change and impact these, it'll be really interesting moving forward. And then Peter will talk about service gaps.
Cool. So consistency across service gaps. We know that these ecosystems have gotten more complex than they ever have. We're starting to connect multiple devices to each other, connecting services to each other. It's starting to become kind of a big ball of wax. So how do we start to make some sense of this? So we've tried to think of some guidelines that make the channels and experiences a little bit more resilient. And I think that's the thing is thinking of resilience, because we know that there's going to be breaks in the system. We know that there's going to be failures when we're connecting all this stuff together. But how do we make the devices still have some level of use? So when we're looking at some of the challenges, right now we know that we have this kind of mobile mothership idea, right? So we have 1 million devices now that are all still tethered to our phones. So what happens when they go off on their own and leave mom behind? What do we do when we're kind of toggling between our wearable devices and then the devices they're paired with? What's that interaction like? And I think the one that's probably the biggest on the horizon is what happens when we actually start to give our data over to these other services. How do we make that consistent? And this is the one I think that we probably don't have an answer for at this point. I think it may be something where all that we really have is well-structured APIs, so at least there's data consistency between services. But how can we start to extend the type of experience that we've created into some of these things and still have some parity? And I think this is the one that's really on the horizon for us, because these are probably the new biggest platforms that have been created in the past few years. So the things that we're looking at here is really looking at kind of the offline mode, what can your wearables do on their own, and then transition points between services. So offline mode. Right now, until we have dedicated data connections, which kind of everybody's been talking about today, our devices are going to need some level of independence. I was incredibly disappointed that the Apple Watch doesn't have a GPS in it, because I still can't go for a run with that watch without bringing my phone with me. It kind of defeated the entire purpose of it, and probably killed it from being a real sports watch. If you look at some of the stuff like the Adidas watch, that has a dedicated GPS. Battery life isn't as good, but if you're using it as a sports watch, you can get 5-6 hours out of it, which should be plenty for most people. So that one I think is huge, is trying to figure out what are those kind of core capabilities that we need to have in our wearable, and how do we make sure that the user is aware of that. So that's kind of the next one here, is making sure that people know what their wearable can and can't do. Right now, most wearables feel a little bit broken when they leave, the mobile mothership, especially smartwatches. The Apple Watch starts to become a bit of a dumb watch. Unfortunately, it can't do a lot on its own. One way that we've been trying to think about this is using this Spotify model as an example. So with a Spotify Pro account, you can sync a certain amount of content to your mobile device. And the only thing that tells you that you actually have lost your data connection is at the very, very bottom here. It actually says offline mode, right here in 6-point font. But the thing that's nice that it does is it lets the content tell you what you can and can't do. So you can see the second track here is completely grayed out. I can't listen to Phil Collins right now, but I can listen to Robbie Williams, right? So it's actually just letting the content tell you what you can and can't do, opposed to making the experience feel broken. The first iteration of this, they actually just got rid of everything that wasn't synced to your phone. And so the experience felt super neutered and broken, and it made you as the customer feel like, oh, my whole UI just changed. What am I looking for? So findability was a problem. The interfaces didn't feel consistent. So this is a nice way to look at it, is how can we just modify the current UI to let people know what's happening? The kind of basic baseline things that we're looking at of what a wearable should be able to do, especially when we're looking at fitness, is still track data and review that raw information. Fitbit's doing a nice job with that. You can actually see all the different data points that it's tracking. Some of the other ones like Misfit, they at least show you your kind of aggregated score that we talked about earlier. So you still get some level of information, and they're not relying on a data connection. But when you're on your watch, you start to lose a lot of those data points that you could be tracking. Fortunately, the Apple Watch is still tracking some things, but it loses, all its GPS connectivity, stuff like that, when it loses its phone connection. Showing progress towards your goal, this is pretty basic, but there are a few wearables out there in the market now. I won't name names, but they do actually stop showing progress once it loses a data connection, which is pretty terrible. And then also show data from the last sync state. So this is something that we've been looking at, especially for use cases outside of fitness, but it's important really to be able to show people, this is where you were at, and here's the, to continue that experience that you were having. So the use case I've been thinking of is if I'm, say, reading something on my watch, and I go through a tunnel and I lose my data connection, does that mean I can't read anymore? Or in the background, can I load 10 pages ahead of where I'm at any given moment? So if I lose a data connection, the experience doesn't break completely. So when we think about transition points, we've been kind of using this little graph here to help us make some decisions. So when the user's transitioning from one device to another, what we want to think about is the cognitive resources they have available at any given moment, and how that helps them or doesn't help them make that transition fluently. So if we look at the top, on your computer you have really high cognitive resources. You can zone out in Photoshop for hours and really get in your flow. You have the ability to unpack really complicated UI, really dig in and understand complex information. But as you go down this list, that ability shrinks pretty dramatically. So with your mobile device, we can still look at pretty complex interfaces. With a smartwatch, a lot less so. When we get to an activity tracker, this is about as basic as possible. This is like just really the nuts and bolts of the information you can display. So if I'm in that situation where I need to transition from a smartwatch to a mobile device, we need to think about what's the user's context in these, and then how does that impact their cognitive resources. Last weekend, I went for a bike ride with the Apple Watch, and I was going probably, 15, 20 miles an hour, and I had Strava running on my watch, and I wanted to just see if I could check my speed. And so quickly, I'm like, oh, how am I going to do this? I have both hands on my handlebars, so I wanted to check speed. So quickly, came up like this, and now I'm going down the road at 20 miles an hour, hand in front of my face, can't see anything. So my phone's actually a better solution for that point, because I can actually reach into my jersey pocket, one-handed, probably still not very safe. Don't tell my mom. But I can still check my speed. I can still do stuff like that. So we're thinking about the transition points. So we think, showing me current activity, great for a smartwatch. Maybe reflecting on data, that's better suited to maybe my mobile device. So thinking about the user's context is really important. So if it knows that I'm traveling at a certain speed, don't prompt me to go look at my phone, stuff like that. So this is just kind of a good tool for us to start thinking about what type of device the user needs to be looking at any given moment. Another kind of key transition point that we're probably all too aware of, and is kind of a necessary evil in these complex ecosystems, is how do you actually sync a device? Some of them involve a lot of kind of complicated hardware. Some sync great between Bluetooth. But overall, it's still a little bit of a messy process. And in some cases, the user doesn't get a great payoff for syncing. With Fitbit, when you actually initiate the sync, you just get a random kind of little loader, and it doesn't tell you how long your sync is actually going to take. And so it can take anywhere from, on a great day when I have, my Wi-Fi is working, it takes, 30 seconds. On a terrible day, it can take 5 minutes, and I'm not sure what's happening, but all I get is this loader that just keeps going around and around. It's kind of a terrible experience. And then once it does sync, it basically just displays in a much prettier format all the information that's already on my device. So I don't get like a nice historical comparison between my current state and my past state. So we need to think about what's that payoff? Like, why do I want to sync? Obviously I want to capture my data somewhere, but can we make something that's actually meaningful to users? With the Jawbone, because there's not really any UI on it, the sync is a little bit more meaningful because that's the one way that you actually get to see your data. But it also gives you a nice little comparison with your historic data. The Misfit has kind of a novel approach to syncing, albeit it's all smoke and mirrors. You actually take the Misfit device and set it on the screen of your phone, and then these cool little wavy lines emanate out from it. But it syncs like with anything else. It's through Bluetooth. So it is kind of annoying because, one, it's not giving you any progress of how long it's actually going to take to sync. And on with this one, it's the same thing with the Fitbit. It's taken anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes to sync my data. But you don't know how long it's going to take. And with this approach, I actually can't use my phone until it's done syncing because I need to set it here. So something we kind of want to be conscious of, because these are those kind of moments in an experience that they're either great and seamless, and you're like, oh, this service feels like magic to me, right? It just, my data automatically syncs. A lot of the new Fitbit stuff is that way, where it's kind of always on Bluetooth, and I never really have to sync anymore. But with stuff like this, it's one of those things where it's cool the first couple times I do it. The 100th time that I do it, when I'm living with this service day in, day out, it starts to become super annoying, and I don't really want to sync my data. And then their payoff, again, is kind of like the Jawbone. It's a pretty decent payoff. One other thing we always think about when we're transitioning between the devices is how do we get some of these kind of visual parodies between services? So we call them kind of the data anchors. So these are things where here with the Fitbit system, you can actually use multiple Fitbits within their system, so you can have a couple different devices. And so the first thing it shows you when you actually open up the app and open up and look at your device is it shows you which device is syncing at a given moment. And then it's also showing you the very first piece of information that's set as your default. So here it's steps. So it's giving you some parity between these two data points. So for the user, makes them understand, yes, this is the device I'm syncing, but I'm already oriented to how the data is displayed. And so I'm transitioned in a little bit easier. And I think lastly, the thing we really want to think about is with current wearables, a lot of this is a lot of manual setup. We're still at that kind of beginning phase of wearables. They're kind of clunky to use, really. But how do we start to learn people's behaviors kind of auto-magically and adapt to what their needs are? So, is that transition or that sync, something, is it download when I have a connection, right? Just automatically do it in the background. Don't make me think about it as a user. Sync when I do something. When X app opens, do this with my wearable service. But let's start to see what we can do in the background that adapts to the user rather than having the user try to adapt to the system. Because like we said before, it's all about kind of supporting the user's adventure and not trying to get them, to focus too much on the overall wearable experience. So again, it's just offline mode and the transition points. So we want to track and review raw information as much as we can, show progress towards your goal always. Show data from your last sync state, and really this is the one I think that's going to be more important with the different types of experiences that we're creating, not just health wearables. And then transition points, we really need to consider when to transition. So we look at kind of people's cognitive abilities and their context, and then visual payoff for syncing, and then showing visual anchors between the devices. But more importantly, let's figure out how we can adapt wearables to user behavior instead of the other way around.
And then just to close out here, we're going to talk, so we've talked about some core design themes that we want to adhere to moving forward. These are some of the emerging patterns that we think we can pretty much bet on being in the game as far as wearables go moving forward. So what are the patterns that are emerging that we can pretty much bet on being able to need to design for. And we can answer this by kind of looking a little bit back to the past when kind of smartphones first emerged. I mean, a lot of us were there when this happened, and we remember all the huge variety of devices, screen sizes, some tactile, some flip, just a huge variety. What's interesting is that now we kind of agree on what's a smartphone. It has the same components. It has some kind of tactile as any kind of benchmark. We can expect a lot of variety to continue to come out, and eventually maybe we'll converge on something that we kind of agree on. Maybe this is a multi-use fitness wearable, or maybe this is just a general purpose wearable. And we may agree in the same way we do agree on what's a smartphone look like, how does it work. So based on that knowledge, there are a few things that we think we can pretty much bank on moving forward. First is there's some degree of fashion here. And what's interesting is we think about this in terms of the color of the hardware, the color of the band, but we should also think about this as designers in terms of the UI of our applications. So if I'm Citibank, for example, what do I want that to look like when I'm being worn on somebody's wrist? Am I still the same brand-wise speaking? Do we use the same colors? Is the user going to be as compelled to wear brands the way we do T-shirts on their wrist? It's an interesting visual design question that I think will come up because we can't forget that now we're going to be wearing UI to a degree. So we have to think about that. Again, tapping, we talked about it as being as a form of input interaction-wise. I think we're going to continue to see more applications based on simply tapping. And we talked about, maybe it's, 2 taps for I'm on my way home, or 3 taps for this, that, or the other. But really thinking about this new custom language, maybe it's a peer-to-peer language that you and somebody important to you just share, or maybe it's something that's more standardized like Morse code. I think the ease of being able to do things like this on your wrist and get some sort of output, get some sort of task done will be really, really interesting. This is an interesting one that, obviously within playing with the Apple Watch, but then looking at some of the other devices, is this idea of speed dialing your responses. So it's awkward to type, or pretty much impossible on a lot of devices. But a lot of times, if I'm going to respond using my wrist, it's probably some sort of stock response anyway. So this idea of creating your custom replies somewhere else and then using them on demand is really interesting. So Apple Watch does it, the bracelet by Intel does it as well. So we can kind of probably bank on some degree of speed dial, not outgoing in terms of the number, but sort of in our replies moving forward. And along those lines, so we'll rethink the way we type, so to speak, but I think products like Spritz here, which is essentially you read one word at a time at a certain speed, at a certain meter. Really interesting to think about, because scrolling kind of works and you can read here, but form factors such as this would be really nicely leveraged with technologies like these. So we'll think about reading differently as well as we'll think about typing and sending messages that way. And again, voice, especially as the technology gets better, and as well, the social acceptance of speaking to your devices also becomes more advanced. We can expect, just more people to be talking to their devices and having it being a normal thing. And then finally, this is what I think will be really interesting, is to be able to program gestures to do certain activities. And the promise here of having a very sensitive gesture recognition chip, I think, is really interesting. I think moving forward, as designers, you can imagine the UI, the notations that you might, notate certain gestures to do certain activities. And that's kind of it. So moving forward, we'll think about Fashion is definitely part of these devices. Language of tapping, gesture recognition, speed dialing your messages, rethinking reading, and vocal control is pretty much, we can count on these to some degree being part of designing for wearables moving forward. And thank you.
Fantastic.
Questions time.
Many times two people can do better job than just one person speaking, right? You did a great job of heading back and forth and, covered quite a lot. I mean, I'm myself a UI guy, I was on the board of what's called IEEE Systems Man and Cybernetics. Complicated name for UI. And you guys are amazing. So, questions?
Yeah.
You talked about common practice in defining UIs and gestures and things like that. Do you see anything from the interface standards that is being involved, like the W3C, for example? They have standards, HTML5 comes out of that. Do you have any kind of standards evolving right now already under that W3C or some other body?
I think so. I think Apple recently released theirs for the watch. Is that? I guess you guys don't know.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they recently released theirs. I think they're continually emerging right now. I think it's very new and it's device specific. But I'm not aware of any like global. If you have a wrist wearable, this is what you need to do. I think we're trying to do some of that here, but in terms of a right or wrong, I think. I think we use our gut, what's right or wrong, but I don't know if there's anything that's set in stone quite yet. I mean, we do have the device.
Once you have a standard like that, there are options, for example, for an Apple Watch to talk to an Android
Yeah.
device, right?
Yeah, and that's,
But you don't see that yet.
Yeah, I don't
Not
think
yet.
the industry's mature enough at this point. It's still kind of the Wild West where everybody's
yeah.
kind of discovering what works for them at this point. I would expect that within the next couple of years at least, though. And I think accessibility is one of the big points there, right? I think the Apple Watch right now and most of the other watches are wildly inaccessible for people with any sort of handicap or disability. So it's something that definitely needs to be thought through, how those can support people, because I think that's one of the unique promises. Is that it's always on technology that could support a lot of kind of key use cases in that area. But agreed, we definitely need some standards there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a matter of time, probably.
If I remember correctly, there's a lot of criticism about using contextual information to change user experience in that it changes the device in a way that the user may not have expected from their usual usage patterns. But I'm wondering if you see that in these sorts of constrained devices that might actually work out better, because there's
It's a good question, by the way.
Yes, the answer is probably yes.
Yeah, I think using context is something that we always have to be aware of, because as technology becomes smarter and smarter, when one company gets that really right, users expect for all other companies to start getting context in the same way. If it's something really sensitive like banking information, maybe we want the overt predictability of something that never changes and every single time it behaves the exact same way. But if it's something that's not as crucial as that, I think we like services that inherently adapt to us and fit our context. I think the watch is something that's really suited to that. I don't know if that answers your question completely, but
just thought, here's your thoughts on that.
yeah.
Anyone else? Looks like there are a few more. Good.
A question about messages, reduced messages. All right, we have. Do you have any ideas about where international standards for what those messages would come from? For example, the poop emoji comes from one culture, the OK signal comes from another. Depending on who's largely going to be consuming devices, what determines what we're all going to recognize as these shorthand messages?
Yeah, so there's a few stock emojis that come with this device, and I think most of those, with the exception maybe of the hand gestures, are probably pretty universal. It also comes with a full set of emojis, just, the keyboard. But I think within the custom replies, like the speed dial, you can create those yourself. On multiple devices already. So you go in and, on a different device and you say, okay, this is probably what I'm going to need to say. Like on mine, for example, today I have a thanks with an exclamation point. So enthusiastic thanks for, I hope your presentation goes well, for example. I used that one this morning. Because I was just in a position where I was like, oh, okay, thanks, there you go. I didn't have to type anything. But I went in earlier and created that knowing that I probably will need it at some point. So it's going to be interesting to see what people go in and pre-create and what they find themselves wishing they had and whether they will go and then create that wishing they had it. I think if it happens enough that, oh, I wish I had my thanks with an exclamation point, they'll go in there and create it. It's maybe a long-winded answer for what you're asking, but I think the answer is there's the custom element to it, and that should cover all those needs.
I think the other part is that we'll start to get into what are culturally sensitive emojis, right? We've started to see that a lot over the last probably month. Apple updated to where now there's, for every person, you can select several different shades of color for every emoji. So how do we get something that's like, universally acceptable as this kind of shorthand language that's not, inherently racist or, has some other kind of amazing pitfall that, some developer didn't think through when they're creating something that they thought was kind of fun and, lightweight and easy to interact with. So when we consider universal languages like that are visual, we need to be really aware of those kinds of contexts.
Yeah, it would be interesting to compare this one which shipped in the US versus a device which shipped somewhere else and see if the palette is the same.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting. I don't know the answer.
My question is maybe the new type of the device with new form factor or new type of the service could ask users to change their habit or the muscle memory, and then that maybe can annoy the users because it's all about the changing the things. So what would be the threshold or what is the smart way to the users to seamlessly change without any the friction?
So I think we talked a little bit about this. I think one of the keys is having those considerate defaults. So you don't enter into a jarring experience. So out of the box, is this ringing loudly when someone messages me and displaying private information by default? But if we have those like set on to vibrate by default, for example, don't display if my wrist is facing out by default. And the Apple, for example, not that this is all wearables, but they do a fairly good job of that. But I think it's being aware of that this is a new device for someone. How do you kind of start them off in a way that's as unobtrusive as possible?
And I think a transparent onboarding process too that tells you what to expect from your service or from your wearable is super important too, because as these are completely new devices to us, the first time someone called me on the Apple Watch, I had my headphones in and I thought I could just answer because I'm plugged into my headphones. And so I was at the checkout at the grocery store, and I answered a call from my girlfriend, and all of a sudden she's talking out of my watch and not through my headphones. And I'm trying to figure out how I can like mute it or get it off, and the only way I could stop it was to hang up on her.
Yeah.
So that's awesome experience. That was my out of the box experience for the Apple Watch. So how do we start to let people know what to expect with these interactions, opposed to just kind of throwing them in the deep end of the pool?
Yeah, that happened to me too. It's like, hey, congratulations, straight to speakerphone on your wrist. Like, when does that ever happen? Like, but that's the default, and is that a considerate one?
Probably not.
Not for a first-time user.
Any more questions? Looks like you did a great job.
Oh.
And then you covered the good 1 hour very, very well.
All right.
Nice.
And you have 1 more hour time for your lunch.
Oh, swell.
Please come back in 1 hour.
Cool.
Thank you a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Excellent job.
Thank you.